Elisha Fenwick had been climbing the spiral staircase of Moreland Head Light since she was 13, long before local folklore pinned the title, Virgin Lighthouse, which, to her soft-spoken silhouette. The tower's cast-iron steps groaned like an old cello under her boots, and every creak felt intimate, as though the structure acknowledged its lone midnight tenant. What the townspeople of Rivermill, Maine saw as eccentricity, those thin copper wires snaking from her weather-scarred satchel, the way she shielded her portable spectrum analyzer beneath a quilted jacket, was, to her, quiet defiance against a life pre-written by granite quarries and lobster traps. She worked days in the single-room branch library, stamping return slips and recommending Edith Wharton to tourists, but when the harbor finally emptied of diesel rumble and gull shriek, she unlocked the keeper's hatch with a key bequeathed by a retired Coast Guard cousin and transformed the lantern chamber into an electromagnetic observatory. She would coil the antenna she built from discarded ham radio parts, feed the signal into her homemade ballon, and listen through studio headphones as the Atlantic broadcast its hidden liturgy, tweaks, whistlers, and the long, whale-slow moan of polar aurora sliding over the ionosphere. On nights when geomagnetic storms spiked, the Fresnel lens around her threw errant flecks of emerald onto the sea, and she imagined the planet talking directly to her in a language older than salt. Even in daylight her double life left fingerprints on the town's collective imagination. Elderly parish ladies whispered that Elisha's refusal to date proved she'd taken a chastity vow in memory of her father, a radio operator lost during the Valentine's nor'easter of 2007. Teenagers spread TikTok theories that she was decoding SOS messages from drowned fishermen. Tourists photographing the Lighthouse Cafe asked if the librarian girl really slept on the catwalk through storms. Elisha never corrected any version. Let them debate whether she was saint, siren, or spinster, each rumor formed a protective layer around the truth that she was composing, piece by electromagnetic piece, a symphony of oceanic static that no one else had bothered to hear. She catalogued her findings in leather-field notebooks, sketching amplitude plots beside fragments of old sea shanties, certain that someday she would prove the so-called noise was patterned, an uncaught dialogue between tide, cloud, and solar wind. The first hint that her solitary experiment would collide with outside ambition arrived on a jade-blue afternoon in late September, when a 185-foot motor yacht eased past the Lobster Pound and anchored beyond the breakwater, its hull slick as gunmetal and its deck crowded with crates stamped Holloway Ventures. Rivermill hadn't seen that surname since a short blur in the business section of the Portland Press Herald. Cassander Holloway, 34, venture capitalist, rumored turnaround alchemist, who bought industrial ruins for pennies and repackaged them into data centers or aquaculture labs. Within hours, fishermen at O'Hara's bar were speculating that Holloway had come for the tidal energy station 2 miles north, an abandoned concrete shell strangled by rusted turbine blades and seaweed. Elisha listened from a corner booth, nursing black coffee gone cold, while purse-lipped selectmen predicted property taxes would finally stabilize. She pretended disinterest, but the name Holloway vibrated in memory. Years earlier her online searches for niche grants in atmospheric acoustics had skimmed a technical paper funded by the same philanthropy arm. That night, as she adjusted the antenna atop Moreland Head Light, she noticed the yacht's floodlights sweeping the water in crisp surgical arcs and felt, for the first time, that her lighthouse might soon have to negotiate its language with another set of ears. Cassander Holloway pushed open the brass and oak doors of the Rivermill Public Library on a Thursday evening just as Elisha was shelving the last of the returned mysteries, and the autumn air that followed him smelled of salt, diesel, and something subtler, burned cedar, perhaps, the ghost of an expensive cologne. He paused on the threshold, taking in the carved trusses and dusty maritime maps with the blank, measuring gaze of someone used to valuing entire buildings in the time it took most tourists to locate the restroom. His tailored peacoat dripped rain onto the welcome mat, but he made no move to remove it. Instead he approached the circulation desk and asked, in a voice whose calm Texas drawl was alloyed with Ivy League crispness, whether the library possessed archival material on irregular geomagnetic activity along the Gulf of Maine, roughly 43 degrees north. Elisha was too surprised to feign nonchalance. Outside specialists sometimes emailed for lighthouse records, but no one had ever asked in person, and certainly not in that precise coordinate language. She led him past stacks of clambake cookbooks to the special collections alcove, a cedar-paneled nook where tide charts from the 1930s hung like faded gospel pages. As she unlocked the sliding mesh gate, he glanced at the wall clock, the gesture of a man accustomed to being billed by the quarter hour, yet when she drew out a yellowed monograph, Auroral Chorus Phenomena of Coastal Maine, 1954, his shoulders lost a centimeter of tension, as though the very sight of primary data slowed his pulse. He settled at the long mahogany table beneath an Edison bulb and began leafing with the care of a surgeon, each page turn punctuated by the soft click of an antique fountain pen jotting notes in a leather field journal. From the corner of her eye Elisha catalogued details: no wedding ring, watch face dark until he tapped it, revealing a tiny holographic spreadsheet, cufflinks fashioned from brushed ruthenium, engraved with fractal spirals. A man of contrasts, saltwater on the coat hem, satellite tech on the wrist, and perhaps, she concluded, a man who could hear static beneath polite conversation. She fetched a dolly of additional texts, ship-to-shore telegraph logs, early NOAA radio surveys, and wheeled it beside him. When he looked up, thanking her with a curt nod, she asked whether his interest was meteorological or commercial. He hesitated, pen mid-air, and answered that a reliable map of coastal interference zones would inform infrastructure upgrades at the tidal station. The practiced openness of the reply couldn't mask its evasive kernel. She pressed gently, suggesting that most investors cared about megawatt hours, not magnetometers. A flicker passed across his eyes, encouragement or warning, she couldn't tell, before he admitted that certain federal contracts rewarded companies able to predict space weather disruptions to undersea fiber lines. Translation: money lay in listening to the sky. Hours slipped by. Rain hardened against stained glass windows, and the fluorescent fixtures dimmed to their energy-saving dusk. Only the two of them and the library's resident ginger cat remained. Cassandra's notepad filled with vector diagrams, Elisha's mind thrummed with the improbable overlap between her private experiments and his corporate curiosity. She noticed, too, his occasional glances toward the far corner where a bronze plaque honored the Moreland Head keepers lost at sea, the very story locals linked to her father's death. Small-town rumor must have reached him already, she realized. A visiting mogul would hear fast about the virgin librarian who talks to storms. The thought heat-lined her cheeks, yet also sparked defiance. Let him believe any myth he wanted, the ionosphere played no favorites. Near closing, as she logged the rare books out of his temporary custody, he asked if the lighthouse beam still operated on its original Fresnel array. The question betrayed an engineer's fascination, not a tourist's. She answered that the array was intact but the bulb long since LED retrofitted, omitting her nightly hijacking of the rotation motor for antenna experiments. He thanked her, pocketed his notes, then surprised her by offering his business card, not cardstock but a matte titanium rectangle etched with microholes that shimmered like diffraction grating when it met lamplight. "Should you ever need better equipment," he said, voice dropping into a confidential register, "call me. Your lighthouse is singing more loudly than you think." After he left, Elisha closed the doors, part hammering a syncopated rhythm she recognized from recording thunderstorms, the waveform of impending upheaval. She returned the monograph to its shelf, but found her hand lingering on its spine. A financier who spoke in kilohertz and coordinates had anchored himself in Rivermill. He saw value in the very frequencies she guarded like sacred scripture. Whether that bode salvation or ruin for her secret symphony, she couldn't yet decide, but she sensed that the long solitude of her experiments had reached its final movement. Outside, the yacht's deck lights sliced the harbor into silver lattices, blinking more strokes across black water, an invitation or a challenge, she couldn't yet translate which. Elisha's suspicion that Cassandra Holloway had arrived with more than tide charts on his agenda hardened the following week when a stack of municipal permit requests hit the bulletin board outside Town Hall. The dry language of the forms, structural assessment, preliminary fiber retrofit, subsurface conduit exploration, belied an aggressive timeline. Surveyors were expected on site at the derelict tidal energy plant within 72 hours, and a temporary fiber trunk would be unspooled across the seabed by month's end. Rivermill selectmen, dazzled by projected tax revenues, approved every line with a rubber stamp enthusiasm usually reserved for summer clam festivals. Only one handwritten note, scrawled in the margin of the environmental impact sheet, betrayed hesitation, confirmed compatibility with lighthouse radio band? That question pierced Elisha's private twilight like a flare. She knew, because she had measured it 100 nights, that Moreland Head's rotating beam already sprayed faint RF harmonics into the upper shortwave band. A high-capacity data trunk, even shielded, would hiss interference across the very kilohertz she monitored. The thought of her auroral choruses drowned beneath corporate packet noise clawed at her lungs. She needed to know precisely what Holloway intended to build, and how deeply its machinery would devour her sky. On a rainless Tuesday she left the library early, claiming a shipment error, and hiked the muddy service road to Tidal Arc. The complex loomed like a shipwreck welded to the headland, concrete intake flumes, barnacle-encrusted pilings, turbine hall windows shattered by decades of Atlantic artillery. Yet fresh boot prints dotted the gravel, and laser-leveled stakes marched across the peninsula in neon-orange rows. She slipped past a sagging fence panel and crouched behind a toppled transformer shell. At the center of the yard a bright white survey drone hovered, scanning with LiDAR while two technicians in Holloway Ventures windbreakers annotated data on tablets. A third worker, heavy-set, buzz-cut, carrying a carbon fiber case, stood at the rusted threshold of the control annex, lifting a slender whip antenna to the wind. Elisha extracted her pocket spectrum receiver, extended its telescoping rod, and tuned to the lighthouse's favorite haunt, 17.230 kHz. Silence. She dialed upward in fine increments, ears pricking for the telltale spherics of distant lightning, but instead caught a staccato sweep, chirped bursts, precisely spaced, climbing in frequency like a digital glissando. Someone was pinging the ionosphere with spread spectrum probes, the very technique she'd dreamed of attempting if she'd ever escaped dial string budgets. Before she could log the waveform, the buzz-cut technician seemed to sense her presence. His head snapped up, mirrored safety glasses flashed. Elisha cursed inwardly and ducked, scraping her knee on corroded rebar. A gull shrieked overhead, masking her hissed breath, and when she risked another glance the technician was tapping his comm set, eyes sweeping the yard. She retreated the way she came, heart galloping, but not before the drone pivoted, its gimbal camera tracking her retreat like a hunter marking range. Back in her attic flat above the bookshop, she plotted the captured packets on her laptop. Each pulse pair fit the classic signature of a sweep frequency interferometer, equipment far more sophisticated than one would deploy simply to lay fiber. She cross-referenced FCC filings. No temporary transmission license had been granted in a 100-mile radius. Illegal spectrum testing, then. Either Holloway was reckless or someone else piggybacked on his project. As she pondered, her phone buzzed, an unknown main number. This is Elisha. Silence, a faint hum. Then Holloway's crisp baritone, I believe you left the library early, Miss Fenwick. Her pulse spiked, mouth suddenly cotton dry. I had errands, she managed. Necessary ones, no doubt. The pause that followed felt deliberate. Since honesty serves both our pursuits, I prefer it. You were at the station an hour ago. My drone saw an unauthorized civilian. The guards assumed vandal, but I recognized the coat. She bristled. Guards. Your permit mentioned surveyors, not private security. Semantics under main code. She imagined his shrug through the phone. The site is hazardous. But I won't pretend I don't value secrecy. Rivermill newspapers can turn a zip tie into a headline. Elisha's knuckles widened around the phone. You're sweeping 17.2 kHz without license. That frequency is used by the lighthouse for safety transmissions. A rustle, maybe of paper, reached her ear. 17.2. The lighthouse has been silent on maritime bands for years, aside from its GPS beacon. His tone sharpened. Are you transmitting? She hesitated, calculating how much to reveal. I monitor atmospheric events. The lighthouse equipment is ideal. Your tests are saturating the window. Another pause, then, unexpectedly, a thread of curiosity softened his voice. Monitor, as in record. You have baseline data? Yes. May I see it? Not until I know what you're measuring. He exhaled, a sound of equal parts frustration and respect. Then perhaps you should join the measurement team tomorrow, 0600 hours. Bring your logs. I'll sign you in as independent observer. Before she could protest, he added, and Miss Fenwick, if another entity is hijacking my site for covert tests, I suspect your baseline will help me prove it. He ended the call without goodbye. Sleep eluded her. She pored over years of notebooks, marking pages where signal strength surged in patterns that never matched solar indices. At 3 a.m. she found an old log from the night her father's trawler vanished, faint Morse fragments at the margin, dots and dashes smeared by static. Her chest tightened. She had been 15 and lacked the math to filter fading shore transmissions. Now, with modern DSP libraries, perhaps, she forced herself to focus. Sentiment could wait until the present threat was mapped. Pre-dawn fog draped tidal arc when she arrived, thermal mug steaming in her unloved hand. Holloway met her beside the turbine hall, hair wind-ruffled, eyes ringed with sleepless determination. He wore work jeans and a high-vis vest, an intentional dismantling of boardroom armor. Welcome to the ruin, he said. Let's decide whether it becomes a lab or a liability. Inside, he introduced her to the buzzcut man, Elias Monroe, ex-NASA comms specialist, who offered a terse apology for yesterday's accidental intimidation. They rolled out spectrum analyzers, set up loop antennas, and initiated a synchronized scan. Holloway kept one eye on the waterfall display, the other on Elisha's hand-drawn plots. Every so often he shot her a look of unvarnished admiration, as though her meticulous pencil lines rivaled any algorithm he'd bought for millions. At 7:12, the same chirped sweep erupted, stronger than ever. Elias's console flagged at origin indeterminate, yet Elisha's quick triangulation with a handheld Yagi traced it seaward, not from the drone or base camp. Holloway's jaw clenched. Pacific Exa, he muttered. They chartered a catamaran last night, supposedly hydrographic mapping. Elisha didn't know the corporate feud, but she recognized audio sabotage when she heard it. Your tide rights give you priority. Under FCC Section 15, unlicensed radiation causing harmful interference must cease. And if they don't? Elias asked. Holloway looked at Elisha, a spark of reckless opportunity flaring. Then we prove interference in a way even headline lawyers can't spin, live data, streamed to every maritime monitor on this coast. It took 40 minutes to jack the lighthouse's dormant VHF antenna into Tidal Arc's fiber switch, another 10 to script a relay that overlaid X's rogue sweeps against Coast Guard safety channels. At exactly 8:03 the combined feed lit up Portland's harbor master display with crimson warnings. Within minutes, the catamaran's call sign crackled across Channel 16, requesting immediate dialogue. Elisha listened, triumphant, as Holloway coolly cited statutes, offering live evidence packets. The rogue vessel promised shutdown, the chirps died mid-sentence. Silence settled over the turbine hull. Holloway turned to her, awe unhidden. You just shielded my entire project with a lighthouse older than radio itself. She flushed, uneasy with praise but exhilarated by the collaboration. You said the lighthouse was singing. Sometimes it bites, too. A grin, genuine, disarming, cut across his face. Then perhaps we rescore the duet. He extended a grease-smudged hand. She hesitated, then shook, feeling the callus of long hours wrapped around spreadsheets and, now, wrenches. Outside, fog shredded into sunlit ribbons, and for the first time she wondered whether the long-guarded chorus she loved might be ready for an audience larger than one. Cassander spent the next 2 weeks orchestrating what the Rivermill Gazette breathlessly billed, a maritime salon, equal parts town hall and tech demo, timed for the October equinox when both the tidal range and tourist appetite peaked. The venue, to widespread surprise, was not the half-gutted station but Moreland Head Light itself. He negotiated with the Coast Guard, hired riggers to install temporary safety rails on the catwalk, and posted invitations at the diner promising mulled cider, panoramic night views, and a short presentation on how tidal data centers could coexist with heritage landmarks. Elisha watched preparations with ambivalence bordering on dread. The lighthouse was her sanctuary, a place where she controlled every variable from filament noise to her own heartbeat. Handing its keep to investors and council members felt like affixing a carnival midway to the nave of a cathedral. Yet she also sensed an opening. With enough foresight, she could use Holloway's stage to prove that Moreland Head was more than picturesque masonry, it was an instrument whose song deserved preservation. She spent late evenings soldering a slim coupler that could patch her spectrum analyzer into the old lamp rotation motor without disrupting the Coast Guard's automated beacon. The device, no larger than a fountain pen, would feed live EM readings to a laptop hidden beneath the lectern Cassander insisted on setting up near the lantern. If the night sky cooperated with even a minor geomagnetic flutter, she could project the waveform through the glass in real time, turning the tower itself into a resonant oscilloscope. When she proposed the idea to Cass, he raised an eyebrow, half skepticism, half dare, then gave her carte blanche so long as nothing breached the safety code. On the afternoon of the event, fog draped the harbor like muslin and the wind carried an undercurrent of ozone Elisha knew too well, a low-pressure trough heaving in from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. She arrived hours early, checking guy wires around the lens housing, tracing every cable path twice. Cass appeared near sunset, sleeves rolled, hair tousled by brisk air, greeting delivery crews who carried trays of smoked haddock, local cider, and, unexpectedly, portable battery banks the size of suitcases. He explained that the tidal station's grid feed was still unreliable, the batteries would keep lighting and projectors alive if the weather flicked the main line. His glance lingered on Elisha's toolkit with a mixture of pride and worry, as though her black Pelican case housed both salvation and scandal. Guests began climbing the lighthouse stairs at 7:30, selectmen in fleece vests, lobstermen still smelling faintly of bait, high school seniors live-streaming each step for social credits. A string quartet from Portland tuned on the lower landing, their arpeggios drifting upward in ghostly spirals. Elisha threaded through the crowd, checking the coupler's Bluetooth handshake, heart kicking each time she saw the signal spike green. Outside, clouds thickened, diffusing the dusk into pewter, offshore buoys reported rising swells, the weather station pinged an advisory, which the town clerk read aloud only to shrug, every coastal gala risked rain. Cass opened the program at 8:15, speaking without microphone, trusting the lens chamber's stone acoustics to carry. He described tidal data centers in plain, punchy clauses, pivoted to the economic uplift for a town hemorrhaging young families, and closed with a pledge that no heritage beacons would dim under his watch. The crowd applauded, but the gesture felt polite rather than convinced. Then, with a small theatrical bow toward Elisha, he ceded the floor. She had rehearsed her piece, yet the reality of 50 expectant faces, the storm's low growl, and Cassander's unblinking confidence pressed on her diaphragm like an anvil. She steadied herself by sliding one palm along the iron balustrade, feeling its chill, and began, first, a rapid primer on VLF whistlers, next, a deft tie-in to maritime safety, finally, the heart of her belief, that the lighthouse, acting as a giant dielectric resonator, could translate the invisible language of the upper atmosphere into something humans might feel. Polite interest edged toward fascination as colored spectrograms pulsed on the projector sheet hung between two girders. At that precise moment the mains failed. Overhead bulbs flickered, cut, and left only the emergency LEDs embedded in the stair treads, pale red like shipboard night lights. A collective gasp issued from the guests, quickly followed by nervous laughter. Cass shot a look at the battery technician who scrambled for breaker boxes. Elisha's own pulse stuttered, then raced ahead, this was either disaster or divine cue. She toggled her laptop to battery, verified the coupler still powered, and engaged the modulation routine she had guarded in encrypted archives. The rotation motor groaned, accepting a new PWM frequency. The Fresnel prisms caught the slight oscillation and split the LED beacon into shards of green and violet. A hush fell as the lantern chamber filled with auroral glimmer, each color pulse tied to live amplitude deviations in the VLF band. The quartet below, hearing the crowd's sudden silence, ceased playing, allowing the tower to breathe its own chord, the motor's low hum, distant thunder, and, after 10 aching seconds, the unmistakable flute-like note of a rising whistler captured 40 miles over the sea, pitch shifted into audible range and funneled through the lantern's hollow core. People forgot their phones, or rather, they raised them but did not move, hypnotized. The green flare intensified, mapping the whistler's descending harmonics as a column of shifting light that raked the glass and painted emerald ripples across the fog. From the staircase came an impromptu cheer. One of the students shouted that the lighthouse had turned into the northern lights. For Elisha, the moment unfolded in slowness, her data scrolling, the thunder aligning with spectral lines. Cassandra's silhouette caught mid-step toward her station, face lit by the same green he'd sought in prophet forecasts but found now in raw sky electricity. The spell broke when the backup batteries clicked online and conventional floodlamps sputtered to life, bleaching the aurora imitation. The whistler, too, faded as the ionospheric duct drifted west. Murmurs replaced wonder, the crowd shifted, seeking cues on applause etiquette after witnessing something that felt half scientific demonstration, half sacrament. Cass filled the gap, voice steady but eyes still barefoot in astonishment. He thanked everyone for riding out the glitch, praised Elisha's unexpected son et lumiere, and suggested refreshments on the catwalk where the fog had opened a narrow view of moonlit whitecaps. As guests dispersed, he approached her console, gaze flicking between the code window and her flushed cheeks. "You rerouted the rotor frequency," he said quietly, awe trimmed with accusation. "I gave that motor a safety inspection clearance 3 hours ago." She braced for reprimand, but his lips curved instead. "And you just won 12 months of engineering goodwill in 12 seconds. He gestured toward the murmuring townsfolk, many now raving to officials about educational tourism potential. "They'll vote funds for this tower before dawn if I ask. I'm almost jealous." Elisha exhaled a laugh that trembled. "Then ask." And carved the budget line for interference shields. The battery tech signaled that grid power was stable. Music resumed on the lower landing. Cassandra extended a hand, not for a shake but to offer the titanium business card she still kept in her coat. "Take custody," he murmured. "Tomorrow we draft a joint protocol, your sky, my sea, no secrets." She closed his fingers around the card instead, pulse steadying now. "Protocols can wait. Tonight let them keep the story that the lighthouse sang." He gave the smallest nod, a surrender to wonder, and stepped back as she packed the coupler. Below, cider steamed, violins climbed into reels, and the fog outside flashed sporadic silver, distant lightning acknowledging, perhaps, that its private monologue had met an unexpectedly resonant reply. Cassandra's Monday began at dawn in the gutted turbine control room, staring at a legal pad covered with 2 columns, civic wins, and technical risks. Saturday night's lighthouse spectacle had rocketed across New England social feeds. Clips of emerald beams synced to Storm Whistler audio garnered 500,000 views by Sunday noon, and the town that had once eyed him like a marauding shark now queued at the diner to thank him for bringing science home. Yet beneath that glow pulsed an engineering migraine. Moreland Head's century-old lens, coaxed into resonating by Elisha's improvised PWM hack, had survived the stunt, but the rotation gearbox showed hairline spider cracks from torsional stress, and the Coast Guard's regional commander wanted assurances no future art events would compromise beacon duty. Worse, Holloway Ventures lawyers reported Pacific Exa had lodged a formal complaint with the FCC, alleging that unlicensed emissions from the lighthouse threatened nearby transatlantic fiber links. Cass suspected the filing was less about bandwidth and more about tightening a litigation noose around his tidal station bid. At 9 sharp he briefed Elisha across a metal worktable cluttered with servo parts. She arrived wearing a fisherman's knit sweater 3 sizes too large, smelling faintly of solder and rosemary shampoo, carrying her notebook like a court affidavit. He had expected either defiance or apology for hijacking his gala. Instead, she offered a distilled summary of structural fatigue data, courtesy of a retired Coast Guard engineer she'd bribed with blueberry fritters. She concluded the lighthouse lens could tolerate harmonic modulation if amplitude stayed below 40% of Saturday's peak. Cass listened, enthralled by the way her voice blended anecdote and calculus, then admitted the larger storm, X's FCC complaint. She absorbed the news with a mathematician's squint, tapping her pencil tip against her bottom lip before proposing a counter-strategy unsettling in its audacity. "Give the FCC what it actually wants," she said. "An interference mitigation field test. We stream both our signals, their catamaran spread-spectrum pings and Moreland Head's controlled resonances, in a controlled window. Independent observers verify no conflict. If EXA objects, they reveal they were sweeping without license first." Cass leaned back, picturing headlines if such a face-off went public. "They'll claim proprietary technology. They'll call your lighthouse a vanity oscillator. Then let's not make the lighthouse the star," she countered. She flipped her notebook to a page of sketches, an aerial of tidal arc with concentric antenna arrays on the seaward breakwater. "We install a phased VLF array on your property. We run simultaneous sweeps with transparent documentation. The lighthouse only monitors. No heritage risk. The FCC loves cooperative research, especially when rural broadband is a subchapter." He whistled low. "Phased loops. You realize the copper alone. I've already calculated, we salvage bus bars from the decommissioned substation in Woolwich." She patted the notebook. 24 coils, each 3 meters. We tune them to whisper, not shout." Cass felt a grin tug despite looming legal dragons. "You make guerrilla engineering sound like a bake sale." "Bake sales keep libraries open," she replied, eyes sparking. "And data sets keep laboratories honest." By noon they had mapped a project timeline taped to the wall: 1 week to fabricate coils, 2 days to calibrate, a Friday demonstration for FCC observers invited under the guise of a community STEM outreach. Cass tasked Elias Monroe, the ex-NASA comms specialist, to design low-noise amplifiers. Elisha secured volunteer labor from the vocational tech students who had first filmed the green beam spectacle. She told them the loops would be ear trumpets for the planet, and the teens signed on as though enlisting for cosmic battle. Work accelerated like spring thaw. Forklifts shuttled salvaged copper to the breakwater. Cass personally drilled mounting holes in the granite revetment, his palms blistering despite gloves, secretly welcoming the pain as penance for years of deals sealed with keystrokes rather than calluses. Elisha, feet braced on slippery rocks, orchestrated coil placement with the authority of an air traffic controller, shouting impedance targets over crashing surf while her braid whipped like a pennant. In brief coffee breaks they argued over naming conventions. He favored industry-tame acronyms, she countered with mythic references, and settled on Project Charybdis, reasoning that a maelstrom guarding data lines suited both romance and cautionary tales. Midweek brought the first counterpunch. Pacific X's catamaran anchored brazenly inside the harbor, its glossy composite hull bristling with radomes. Their PR account released a statement painting Holloway Ventures as recklessly courting electromagnetic hazards in a fragile fishing economy. The Gazette printed it verbatim above the fold. Cass cursed the predictable optics and drafted a rebuttal heavy on economic impact numbers, but Elisha stopped him. "Let them talk," she said. "Every tweet they send drives viewers to Friday's live stream. Spectacle amplifies signal." She was right, though part of him still bristled at playing chess in the court of public performative outrage. Thursday's sunset bled copper across the bay as final calibration began. The loop array rose like a metallic Stonehenge, cables snaking into a shipping container retrofitted as ops center. Inside, oscilloscopes bloomed green comets, laptops rendered real-time waterfalls. When Elisha powered the array, a hush fell, the kind that precedes rocket launches and cathedral masses. Speakers crackled to life with distant spherics, and then, unmistakably, a rising VLF chorus serrated the silence, nature's radio choir. Students high-fived, even Elias, stoic by profession, muttered "gorgeous" under his breath. Moments later, a sharper, synthetic chirp sliced the feed, X's probe. The ops container lights dimmed as if the catamaran had siphoned wattage from the air itself. Elisha and Cass exchanged a glance thick with adrenaline. She tapped a macro, and Charybdis appended metadata to the rogue sweep in real time, stamping coordinates and amplitude. The system then folded the sweep back into X's frequency in a subtle phase-inverted echo, polite but undeniable proof of reception. Within seconds, the chirps ceased. A message arrived on Cass's satellite phone, no sender, only a single sentence, impressive instrumentation. See you tomorrow. That night, Cass found Alasha atop the lighthouse catwalk, bundled in blanket and fatigue. She held a thermos of chamomile and silently handed it over. Below, the loop array's faint LED status lights winked Morse-like in the dark. Cass confessed he hadn't felt this alive since prototyping his first hydro-storage model a decade ago, before venture capital turned men like him into abstractions. Alasha listened, then admitted that collaborating terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The solitude she once wore as armor now felt like an abandoned cocoon. Their shoulders brushed, static leaped skin to skin, and for a heartbeat he considered cupping her face, but she shifted first, pointing to the star-speckled quadrants where Orion's belt cleaved the sky. She named each star, his heartbeat sinking to the quiet confidence behind every syllable. Friday's demonstration unfolded under crisp, pale sunlight. FCC engineers in windbreakers, local press, even a Boston public radio crew gathered on folding chairs arranged like an impromptu senate. Cass opened with disclaimers about safety, then ceded the stage to lead research collaborator Miss Fenwick. She walked them through the array's purpose, to reconcile heritage frequencies with modern infrastructure, then triggered the scripted sequence. Charybdis swept, Moreland Head monitored, X's catamaran answered with its own burst. Every step logged, projected, time-stamped. 40 minutes later, the FCC delegate concluded that no harmful interference persisted when protocols were transparent. Reporters swarmed, but the soundbite they all captured belonged to a high school senior who blurted, "It's like we just watched the ocean and the internet make peace." That evening, X's vessel weighed anchor without comment. Cass received an encrypted email, "Consider your coast staked. Another battlefield awaits." He read it aloud to Alasha. She merely shrugged, saying, "Our battlefield has better scenery." They toasted with paper cups of blueberry mead provided by the grateful fishermen's co-op and watched fog roll over Charybdis, its loops humming like dormant harps. When midnight came, they walked the gravel path back to the lighthouse. At the base of the tower she paused, moonlight pooling in her eyes. "You realize," she said, voice barely above the surf, "once data starts flowing, some of it doesn't flow back." He took her meaning, time, solitude, the porous boundary between scientific partnership and something more precarious. He answered by removing a slim flash drive from his jacket. It contained the phase shift algorithm he kept proprietary for years, the one that had made his first fortune. "Call it reciprocal current," he said, placing the drive in her palm. Her breath caught, data was his fiercest currency. She closed fingers around the metallic sliver, a silent pact forged between tide and sky, venture and vigil, and allowed his hand to remain over hers a moment longer than any prior handshake would sanction. Above them the beacon revolved, steady and indifferent, but inside its rhythmic pulse both heard a new undertone, a basso counterpoint born of shared engineering, shared risk, and the startling possibility that the language Alasha once deciphered in solitude had found another fluent speaker. The equinox had passed, but October refused to surrender its storms, and by the second week a black-spined nor'easter rolled up the Atlantic like a siege engine. Fishermen hurried to dry dock lobster boats, tourists fled inland, highway marquees flashed gale warning in amber capitals that flickered like Morse. For Alasha and Cassander, the tempest felt less like an inconvenience than an unannounced final exam. If Moreland Head and Project Charybdis could survive Category 1 fury without dropping a packet or cracking a prism, their partnership would earn a legitimacy no press release could counterfeit. They spent the morning before landfall tying down every coil with double marine line, then retreated to the lighthouse service room that now served as joint command. A propane heater hissed at their feet. Oscilloscopes blinked an anxious green across the workbench, translating wind into jagged saw teeth. Outside, the first gusts hammered the tower, and the lantern room amplified each impact into a cathedral subbase you could feel in your ribs. By twilight the wind screamed steady at 50 knots, rain arrived sideways, stinging against the glass in sheets so dense the beam barely pierced 50 yards. Elisha's laptop chimed a geo-tagged alert, the turbine hull's pressure sensors were fluctuating. Cass cursed softly, the storm shutters on the intake vents were supposed to seal automatically. He grabbed a rain shell. She started to protest, gusts like this made walking the breakwater a hanging offense, but he reminded her the station's sub-basement housed $3 million in converters and her priceless loop array cabling. If seawater reached the equipment, weeks of work would turn to rust. She insisted on joining, 2 pairs of hands, half the trip duration, and he relented, adding an emergency radio to her pack. They departed the tower, leaning into wind so fierce it flattened the sea's surface into a racing skin of hammered pewter. The breakwater's granite blocks sweated slippery algae. Every 7th wave sloshed ankle-deep across their path. Midway, Elisha's headlamp illuminated a tangle of nylon rope where none should be. She knelt and found its end looped through a freshly drilled anchor in the rock, tied in a sailor's slip knot, the sort you'd use to haul cargo overboard. The knot was new, she could smell the synthetic fibers, not yet salted. Her gut chilled with a dread colder than rain. Cass urged haste, vent shutters first, mysteries later. Inside the turbine house the storm roared as if the Atlantic itself had been funneled through the intake tunnels. Emergency strobes painted the hull blood red. The shutter motor's PLC showed a fatal fault, manual override only. They wrestled the wheel together, metal shrieking, then felt a hollow thunk as steel plates slammed into place. Decibel levels dropped from jet engine to subway tunnel. Cass keyed the console, diagnostics reported stable. But just as relief slackened his shoulders, Elisha noticed condensation on the fiber trench, salt water creeping through hairline cracks in the floor. Someone, she realized, had drilled weep holes from the exterior, turning the breakwater into a Trojan floodgate that circumvented the shutters entirely. She traced the seep to a ragged channel bored near the seawall junction. A faint chemical odor, thermite residue, burned her nostrils. Pacific Exa. Who else had motive and maritime access in gale conditions? She snapped photos, radioed Elias back at Lighthouse Ops to log sabotage, then helped Cass shovel sandbags stored for just such contingencies. They staunched the trickle, but ocean pressure climbed with every wave, the bags bowed like lungs. Cass checked time, high tide in 45 minutes, height record-breaking. If the breach widened before then, Charybdis's power trunks would short, and the station might slip off his balance sheet forever. They radioed Elias again. His reply drowned in static, then a single phrase cut through, drone inbound, repeat, inbound. Elisha and Cass exchanged bleak recognition. In open weather X's Natfast quadcopters could dance rings around any storm, wind might ground helicopters, but drones with sealed rotors and adaptive gyros could still fly low above the surf. Their objective? Possibly sabotage the lighthouse's rotation motor, maybe even drop EMP charges into the coil yard. Cass sprinted for the exit, she followed, lungs burning. Outside, rain had thickened into horizontal needles. They reached the midpoint of the breakwater just as a matte black drone skated overhead, barely 20 feet above the waves, strobing IR. It carried a cylindrical payload the size of a thermos, glowing faint amber through its casing, a self-heating acid capsule, by the look of it, designed to eat copper. One splash on the loop arrays and signal integrity would dissolve like sugar. No time for subtlety. Elisha yanked the emergency radio from her pack, flipped to 162.400 MHz, the weather broadcast channel every vessel monitored, and keyed the mic. In a steady voice she transmitted a distress code, appending faux coordinates that placed a downed pleasure craft directly along the drone's flight path. Federal rescue beacons carry priority. Within seconds the NOAA repeater rebroadcast her call, flooding civilian maritime receivers. The drone AI's collision avoidance algorithms, programmed to dodge official emergency corridors, altered course, climbing sharply. Gale winds slapped it sideways, it pinwheeled, regained posture, but the payload jerked loose, splashing harmlessly into the sea. Seconds later the drone arced landward, control link likely overridden by a remote pilot. Cass laughed, incredulous. "You spoofed the Coast Guard?" "Borrowed," she corrected, heart pounding. "We'll file reports later." They scrambled the last yards to the lighthouse, slammed the pressure door, and shed dripping gear. Elias met them on the stairwell, ruffled but intact, the array still hummed. Yet the night was not through. The sabotage report galvanized the FCC delegate who still lingered in town. By radio he ordered Charybdis locked down until federal investigators arrived. Cass bristled, downtime equaled lost investor confidence, but Elisha surprised him by agreeing. Transparency, she argued, was now their sharpest spear. They would let the feds find every drilled hole and chemical trace. EXA could not spin sabotage as neighborly competition. What she did not voice, because exhaustion pressed it behind her teeth, was her fear that EXA would escalate beyond property to people. Cass read the worry anyway. They lingered by the lamp's maintenance hatch as gale gusts shook the tower. He asked, haltingly, whether she wanted relocation until the probe finished. She shook her head. "If I run, the signal dies," she said. "My father's last broadcast still sits in a logbook because no one stayed to decode it." Cass rarely touched her, yet now he set both hands on her shoulders, steady despite storm tremors. "Then I stay, too," he said. "No asset worth more than the operator." She tried a smile but tears slipped unbidden. He brushed them with a thumb, eyes dark in lantern shadow, and though the moment balanced on the cusp of something they'd both avoided naming, they let it hover, sustained like a cello's open string, neither consummated nor dismissed. An hour before dawn the storm broke, leaving a sky scrubbed raw and brilliant. Sunlight speared through fractured clouds, striking the loop arrays with shards of gold. Investigators in DHS jackets photographed drill holes while news drones filmed from respectable distance. The Gazette editor tweeted companies clash, community stands firm, pairing it with a photo of Elisha and Cass, sodden, bruised, but unbowed, on the seawall at first light. Online sentiment skewed instantly against Pacific EXA, markets followed, shaving 2 points off their stock by noon. Back at command, Charybdis resumed scans under federal supervision. The data sung, storm spherics, post-cyclone whistlers, a dawn chorus so vivid students wept in headsets. Cass sent real-time snippets to investors, framing them as proof of resilience. Elisha archived every byte, her mind already orchestrating the world's first open-source symphony of a nor'easter. That night, when calm finally settled, she climbed the lighthouse alone. The lamp's rotation motor glided at nominal speed, its hum like a lullaby. She dialed the gain low, just enough to hear the planet's residual static, soft, almost intimate, then pressed the flash drive Cass had given her into the notebook where her father's last transmission slept. 2 codes laid side by side, one for capital, one for memory. She realized she trusted them both now, equally necessary, equally mutable. Beyond the glass, stars that the storm had masked all night emerged in disciplined patterns, each one a coordinate on some celestial ledger. She whispered a thanks to them, to the tower, to the improbable alliance forged by sabotage and sound, and began a fresh page, Chapter 6, First Light After Siege. Once the nor'easter's debris had been cleared and the federal inspectors issued a preliminary report naming Pacific EXA as likely aggressor, Rivermills Town Council scheduled a public hearing to decide whether Holloway Ventures would receive the final lease that would turn Tidal Arc from provisional asset into a 40-year concession. The meeting was set for a Thursday night inside the high school gymnasium, a space that normally smelled of floor wax and adolescent sweat but now bristled with national press, fisheries lobbyists, and EXA's high-priced attorneys in rain-dark overcoats. Elisha sat in the second row clutching her father's weather-stained logbook like a talisman, while Cassander paced behind the bleachers conferring with Elias and a litigation team who kept whispering about burden of proof, breach of fiduciary duty, and the nuclear option, filing an injunction that would freeze every rivet of Tidal Arc until 3 separate courts chewed through the sabotage evidence. There was something brittle in Cass that evening, a tension Alasha recognized from her own nights wrestling with antique receivers, the dread that a single mistuned knob could send hours of fragile signal skittering into oblivion. She folded her hand over his forearm as he took a seat beside her, and the touch seemed to ground him, the restless tapping of his heels slowed. Yet when the council chairwoman opened proceedings and immediately granted the floor to Pacific X's lead counsel, Cass's spine went iron straight again. The attorney, a silver-templed rhetorician named Marston Dale, spoke for 30 relentless minutes, his baritone rolling through the gym like cold molasses. He painted Holloway as a serial speculator who left half-finished husks of industrial optimism, from Baja to the Bosporus, insinuated that the nor'easter sabotage could just as plausibly have been an insurance stunt, and, in the final act, presented freshly unearthed court documents linking Cass's first hydropower venture to an insider trading probe. Murmurs rippled through metal folding chairs, camera shutters snapped. Cass sat frozen, jaw tight, the old shame resurfacing under fluorescent glare. Elias muttered a curse, but Alasha felt something else, a rising indignation that Data, their most honest ally, was being drowned by curated narrative. When the chairwoman called for rebuttal, Holloway's corporate lawyer began a careful, sedate defense, but Alasha touched Cass's sleeve and whispered, "Let me." He glanced at her, startled, then nodded once, a gesture of trust so complete it frightened her more than the cameras. She rose, notebook in hand, and walked to the microphone, boots echoing on the varnished maple floor. She did not start with technical jargon or legal citations. Instead she opened the logbook to a page dated February 14, 2007, letting the overhead projector display her father's slanted Morse monitoring report, SOSGF 122, storm static heavy, copying partial. She told the audience about a teenage girl who recorded that faint call while the Coast Guard repeaters were jammed by solar noise, a call that was never triangulated in time. She explained how, years later, analyzing that log with modern DSP had revealed the trawler's sinking coordinates, proof that better noise mitigation protocols might have saved 6 lives, including her father's. "The first time I heard the phrase, data center," she said, voice steady but taut, "I imagined a place where raw noise goes to become something that saves people." Then she pivoted, seamless, like turning a telescope to a new star, into Project Charybdis. She projected live spectrograms recorded during the sabotage storm, overlaying X's rogue frequency sweeps with the time stamps of the drilled seawall holes identified by DHS. She showed how the interference patterns matched the catamaran's AIS logs, how the acid capsule's spectral trace aligned with chemicals recovered from the loop array, and finally, how, after the drone incident, Charybdis's phased loops captured a retreat burst whose watermark, an encrypted vendor ID, belonged to a subcontractor on X's own procurement list. The gym fell silent except for the cooling hiss of the projector. She ended with a single frame, Cassandra's proprietary phase shift algorithm, now open-sourced, running in simulation against NOAA space weather feeds, demonstrating that the upgraded station could predict ionospheric outages for transatlantic cables with 92% accuracy. "Sabotage fears governance," she concluded. "Transparency fears nothing. We invite every university, every fishermen's union, every regulatory body to audit us in real time. Keep the lighthouse honest, and the lighthouse will keep you safe." Applause began hesitantly from the back row where the vocational tech student sat, then swept forward like a tide engulfing shoreline. Marston Dale's expression curdled, X's co-counsel whispered urgently, but the damage was done. The chairwoman conferred with council members, then announced that the lease vote would proceed immediately rather than delay for further discovery. Paper ballots circulated, were tallied under dual supervision, and revealed a 6-1 decision in favor of granting Holloway Ventures the 40-year concession, with an amendment requiring all environmental and spectral data be mirrored to a public repository managed by the State University Consortium. Cass looked at Alasha as though seeing sunrise after months of polar night. When photographers surged, he navigated them to a side corridor and pressed his forehead lightly to hers, a silent benediction lost on the clicking lenses. "You turned the noise into music," he murmured. She shook her head. "We did. You gave me the processing power." Outside, the night was crisp, windless for the first time in days. Harbor water reflected the gym's sodium lights in jittery ribbons. They walked toward the lighthouse, neither speaking, both acutely aware that the path before them was no longer merely professional. At the base of the tower, Cass paused, producing a small velvet-lined box from the pocket of his peacoat, not the sleek titanium flash drive kind of gesture she might have expected from him, but something deliberately old-world. "I bought this weeks ago and kept waiting for a calm day," he said, voice roughened by fatigue and hope. "Turns out calm is overrated." She opened the box. Inside lay a ring of brushed meteorite alloy inlaid with a thin coil of salvaged lighthouse copper, the interior engraved with 3 shortwave frequencies, her father's SOS, the first auroral whistler they decoded together, and the Charybdis control band. "Not a proposal," he clarified softly, "that's another conversation, on another tide, but a covenant of shared frequencies." Elisha slipped the ring onto her middle finger, where it hummed faintly against her pulse point, and answered by pulling him into the illumination spill of the rotating beam. The light swept over them in patient revolutions, sealing the moment on every third pass. Far offshore, Pacific X's catamaran cruised southward, sensors cold, its legal team drafting new strategies in the dark. But closer, within a mile radius of Moreland Head, Charybdis loops whispered across the water, capturing the subaudible churn of humbled engines and translating it into a data point, one more line in the ever-growing ledger of a coast that had decided, at last, to listen to itself. The first tidal node went live at dawn on the winter solstice, when the moon's pull was strongest and every granite block of the breakwater thrummed like a struck bell. Cass Sander had insisted on that symbolism, pivoting the year at its darkest hinge, because dark hinges, he said, reminded people that mechanical beginnings rarely arrive under halcyon skies. The grid interconnect team counted backward, coils of Charybdis surging to precisely calibrated resonance, 3 switchgear stations clacked in buttery succession, and for the first time in 4 decades electrons harvested from the bay's push-and-pull course through the old concrete arteries and spilled onto Maine's power graph. Inside the control vestibule, Elisha watched a vermilion bar on the SCADA screen rise above nominal, then crest without flicker. The waveform settled, a perfect sine clothed in inaudible harmonics that matched her simulations within 1/10 of a decibel. She did not cheer, cheering felt too small, yet her lungs expanded as though the Atlantic had exhaled squarely into her sternum and replaced bone with buoyancy. The community arrived in trickles that soon became a river, fishermen in waterproof bibs, high school coders clutching smartphones, retirees who remembered the station's first, ill-fated commissioning in 1978. They were met by Votech volunteers who ushered them into an exhibit hall fashioned from a refurbished transformer vault, where holographic panels traced every step from tide to transistor. Cass's engineers had staged a dramatic flourish at the end of the corridor, a 2-meter-wide convex display that translated real-time loop array data into auroral ribbons dancing just above head height, low enough for a child to pop soap bubble fingers through simulated solar wind. Local press cameras ate it up, so did the children. No one asked for Pacific X's side of the story anymore. When the company issued a late-night press release warning of unquantified risk, the Gazette buried it below an op-ed about clamflat revitalization. At noon the Coast Guard cutter Ridgeway anchored offshore to test the harbor's upgraded navigation overlay, a 2 kHz safety beacon nested within Charybdis's architecture. When its bridge confirmed signal clarity, a cheer rolled from breakwater to lighthouse catwalk. Elisha allowed herself 5 seconds of closed-eye gratitude, then hurried down to the second sublevel where her private project waited, the final deconvolution pass on her father's logbook SOS. Cass had gifted her a GPU cluster he affectionately dubbed the Penitent, built from repurposed gaming rigs and cooled by seawater circulated through a titanium manifold. Over the past 3 months she had fed it every known variant of early 2000s HF shipboard transmitter distortions, attenuated for distance and lightning static. That afternoon the loss function finally flattened, a green progress line read complete, and below it a block of text rendered in plain English. Vesta star taking water fast at 43°54'19 and 69°0802'W, engine electrical failure. Request tow or evac. The message timestamp, corrected for propagation delay, placed the trawler nearly 4 nautical miles east of where official search grids had concentrated, too far for a crippled diesel to fight incoming swells. The revelation scratched open an old grief, but it also resolved something that had ached unnamed. Her father's last act was not a garbled cry into nothingness, it was a precise coordinate she had finally brought ashore. She uploaded the findings to the Coast Guard Historical Unit, then closed the terminal and allowed herself the smallest sob, a sound more release than sorrow. Evening settled clear and windless, rarer than gold after a season of gales. An outdoor stage had been erected on the quay, its backdrop a chain of festoon lights that rippled over calm water like mirrored constellations. Cass took that stage flanked by the town council and the state university chancellor, but before he could uncap the ceremonial bottle of champagne he motioned Elisha to join him. She did, reluctantly, notebook tucked under her arm. He kept the speech short, a thank you to every hand that hauled cable, a nod to federal inspectors, a lightly veiled jab at companies, who prefer lawsuits to wrenches, and finally a declaration that the lab's next decade would not be measured only in gigawatt hours but in observations of heaven and ocean speaking in the same frequency family. Murmurs of delight rustled the crowd, someone began a slow clap, the champagne cork arced into the bay. But the evening's most startling moment, and its sweetest, came after speeches, when the quartet of Portland strings eased into silence and Cass raised a hand for one more announcement. Harbor floodlights dimmed, the crowd's chatter lowered to a hush. Behind the stage, atop the lighthouse catwalk, a single beam swung into fixed position, no longer rotating, its LED source cooled to a faint cyan. The beam broadened into luminescent fog letters 20 meters tall, 17.23 kHz. Gasps fluttered, locals recognized the storied number from every newspaper article about Charybdis. Then the letters melted into lacy auroral curtains that cascaded over the water, green, violet, pale rose, sourced not from projectors but from laser-excited aerosols launched minutes earlier from a barge Cass had kept off ledgers just for surprise value. When the light reached its richest bloom Cass turned to Elisha, voice soft but microphone hot enough that the front rows overheard, not a proposal yet, but a promise, every major note of your life's work will live here, visible, funded, defended. She answered not with words but by lifting her father's logbook over her head like a benediction. The LED panels on the breakwater loops synced to her gesture, a new frequency string scrolled across them tribute to the message finally decoded. The lighthouse beam tilted, framing both coordinates and curtains, a dual dedication to past and future. The crowd erupted into applause layered with something deeper, communal ownership. Rivermill citizens realized in real time that they were no longer passive witnesses but co-authors of a coast retuned. Later, long after the last cider keg ran dry and the last news van rolled south, Elisha and Cass remained in the tower lantern, alone with the soft servo whir of systems idling at low power. She rotated the meteorite and copper ring on her finger, feeling its faint warmth from body heat and beam glow. Cass watched her, eyes reflecting shards of cyan and violet. Calm still overrated, she teased, voice husky from hours of talking to reporters. He smiled, pulled a small velvet sachet from his pocket, and spilled 3 copper washers into his palm, relics removed that morning from the old gearbox before new bearings were installed. He pressed them into her hand. First artifacts of the retrofit, he said. Proof that even iron hearts benefit from being recentered. She slipped the washers into the logbook's front pocket, where decades earlier her father had kept a spare pencil stub. And proof, she answered, that once noise becomes music, you never mishear it again. Outside, the last of the excited aerosols settled, the sky took back its natural stars. Yet the sea below kept translating tide into torque, torque into electrons, electrons into an indexed symphony on open servers. Far off the catamaran that had once haunted their horizon churned toward a different contract, Pacific X's attorneys nursing defeat in expensive cabin berths. Moreland Head's beacon resumed its slow, sentinel rotation, but to those listening on fringe frequencies it now carried a new undertone, a narrow-band hum riding shotgun on the safety signal, whispering choruses of whistlers and spherics to any ear, human or machine, that cared to listen. And on that clear cold solstice night, 2 such ears, one once tuned to solitude, the other to venture's din, shared the same revolving deck, counting revolutions not in degrees but in futures co-phased.